Hi, it's Mark Graban here. Today I'm sharing something new that my friend Jamie Flinchbaugh and I have been talking about for a while. We finally went through with it. We recorded, it would be the first in a series of podcasts that are a little more loose and conversational than the interviews are in this podcast series. We're sort of inspired by, if you know, the lean coffee format of discussion. We're calling this lean whiskey, and we're not going to talk about whiskey much, but it's me and Jamie, two old friends. We've known each other for 20 years. We have a lot in common. We're going to get together. We're going to share a little whiskey, but we're going to talk about our experiences, things in the news. We're going to, maybe debate some things and try to have fun with it. So, I want to share the first episode in the series here. If you like this, you can go and search your favorite podcast directory, whatever you're using to listen to this. You can search for Lean Whiskey, or you can go to www.leanwhiskey.com. And hope you enjoy this sort of special presentation, or at least it'll be the one and only time I'll bother you with it here. Lean Whiskey.
Mark Graban and Jamie Flinchbaugh are two guys drinking whiskey while chatting about lean ideas, experiences, and news. Let's hope they hold their liquor because they're not holding back on sharing their opinions. It's time for Lean Whiskey, Lean Talk with a fun spirit.
Well, hi, everybody. This is Mark Graban. I want to welcome you to our new podcast, Lean Whiskey. This is our first episode because we're talking lean and whiskey. It's not a dry run. Maybe it's a wet run. What do you think, Jamie?
Yeah, well, it will be once we start sharing some of our whiskey here. So,
Jamie Flinchbaugh, of course, here. We're really happy to be doing the podcast together. We've been talking about this for a little while. For those of you who don't know, Jamie and I have known each other for, is it 20 years now?
Yeah, I think so. I think it would be maybe 21 probably is when we first met.
So we've crossed paths many times. We have the shared lean interests. We were both in the same program at MIT, the Leaders for Global Operations program. Jamie was you were 1 year ahead of me, right?
1 year ahead, yeah.
Yeah. So that's going back to the late 90s. And Jamie was a contributor to leanblog.org for a while. Then he went and got his own blog, right?
Yeah, it was fun. You were always very open with your platforms, and you've had several, including podcasting. Mm-hmm. And I always enjoyed writing, but it was fun to start to test my experience with blogging with your blog and making contributions to that for quite a while before I did my own.
And that was going back, like 2005, 2006, early.
Right. Goes back quite a while.
Early days of Lean blog. And then, the writing continued. Jamie wrote a chapter for the anthology book that I started and edited, a book called Practicing Lean. Do you remember what you wrote about in your chapter? Of course.
I wrote about my first lean, real heavy duty lean experience at Harley Davidson. Because it set the tone for my, I don't want to say unique perspective, but at least my perspective on lean about how that worked. And so my whole spiel about lean is about behaviors came from my observations at Harley Davidson, installing a large pull system, and that was the focus of my chapter.
Yeah, and we both shared.
I thought it was a great title of a book, right? Because most of us have learned that have been in it for a while, have learned most of it by practicing, not in the classroom, and not even really by books, by practicing and applying.
Yeah. Well, I think you raise an interesting point. We all do have our own unique perspectives on lean because we're unique people. I started my career at General Motors. You were at Chrysler. We're going to talk about that company later in the podcast. We may have read some of the same books, but we've had different mentors and different influences, right?
Yeah, I remember when I built a class many years ago, I mapped out, even if it was just a particular note that I provided to people, I mapped out all the influences on what I was teaching, and it was wide and varied. Some of it very deep historical, some of it just people I worked with that helped shape how I think. And I know there's a couple people that talk about your lean pedigree, right? What's the path you've learned on? And while there's probably some wrong paths, there probably isn't a single right path. Some might disagree with that, but I certainly think there's many ways to develop our own particular unique perspective.
Yeah, talking about pedigree. I wouldn't even call myself a purebred TPS person because I had influences. W. Edwards Deming is really influential on me, and some people. So I guess I'd call myself a mutt. People who combine Lean and Six Sigma. I don't mean that as an insult if they're mutts, but
Yeah, and mine is very heavily colored, I'd say, by two categories. One is people trying to apply TPS, not adopt it wholesale, but apply it to their environments. And I'd say another is the entire learning organization community, because I really immersed myself in the idea that Lean is about learning very early, and help make some of those early connections between those two communities, which have come together and fallen apart many different times. But again, some of my many influences would fall into those two buckets.
Yeah, so one of the reasons we're doing the podcast here, we're both really into learning. We both try to share and teach and keep learning. We're going to try to have some fun in this podcast, right?
Yeah, so that's a good time to talk about the title and what we're doing here, because we've certainly had many. We don't get many opportunities. You live in very different time zone than I live in.
Yeah.
But when we do get together, we have that opportunity. We almost always have a chance to share a whiskey and have a nice, long, casual conversation. So the idea of this being called Lean Whiskey is, imagine if those late night discussions we would have over sharing a shared interest of whiskey, we could record it and it would have some value to somebody. And who knows who out there is really interested in it, but just being able to do this in a semi-structured way, I think is going to be good for me, right? It's that we learn from each other and always have. And most of the time it's just you and I out for a whiskey, but there's other people that like whiskey and lean as well, and I'm sure we'll have them on, but this will be very different than your typical format of Mark interviewing somebody. This will just be us talking about a few things that interest us.
And we're not going to overdo it with the whiskey talk. And if somebody isn't, we're not going to overdo it with the whiskey either.
No, I generally try to pace myself there. And while we will drink whiskey and share what we're drinking, we won't go too deep into the history and all our interest in enjoying whiskey.
Yeah. And, I've owned the domain name leanwhiskey.com for a couple of years and didn't know what to do with it. So here's something to do with it. I think there's some inspiration if people are familiar with Lean Coffee. Lean Coffee, you can go to leancoffee.org. That's a way of facilitating, generally it's group discussions. And, I think a loosely structured enough sort of way. My friend Jim Benson is one of the co-creators of that. So I've facilitated a number of these at different conferences and events. When I've gone to the Society for Health Systems conference, the last couple of years, they've done a session called Lean Cocktails, which that very much follows the Lean Coffee format of brainstorming topics on Post-it notes, having a timer. We're not going to be quite that strict about it, but it's sort of an homage to Lean Coffee.
Yeah, it is. And I think just the high octane coffee, right? The idea is covering lots of topics with some energy and focus and purpose is all part of that. And I've used it at internal conferences at a company. I've used it more casually, but it's a great format, but it is meant to do a lot of quick hits on a lot of topics with a group of people. And, if whiskey's your high octane and whiskey is your slow down and relax, that pretty much characterizes the difference between what we think a lean coffee event is and what we think this podcast is going to be.
Yeah. So we want to thank everyone for giving us a shot. And not again, well, that's a bad whiskey. That was an unintended pun. We're sipping our whiskey. We're not doing shots. But.
We are not doing shots. That's I can't even think of the last time I did that. But we will, in that spirit, we'll sort of.
There's another in spirit. There's another.
Oh yes, I didn't even. I completely unplanned there. So we will pick a theme. We'll both pick a whiskey to enjoy. Each time we do this, we'll see how far we go with episodes and how creative we need to get on the themes. But when most people think about American whiskey, they think about particularly Kentucky bourbon. So that's pretty common. That's where an awful lot of volume is. So our first topic, our first theme is actually American non-Kentucky whiskey, of which there's so much that out there that's non-Kentucky bourbon, non-Kentucky whiskey of other varieties. Mm-hmm. So that's our first theme. So what did you choose within that category?
Well, and if we do 50 episodes, there is literally whiskey being made in all 50 of the U.S. states and many, many countries around the world, and that's fun to explore. So today I am drinking a Texas straight bourbon whiskey, and for those who think bourbon can only come from Kentucky, that's actually a federal designation, and I'm drinking one of my favorite. It is my favorite Texas whiskey from a distillery called Garrison Brothers, which is about an hour west of Austin. And I'm drinking what they call their Balmorhea straight bourbon whiskey. It's been aged 2 years in American oak and then aged another 2 years in a second different barrel. It creates a really rich and complex whiskey. And it was recently named the American Micro Whiskey of the Year by James Murray, the author of the Whiskey Bible. So I love it. The fact that other people love it is going to make it increasingly difficult to find, but that's what I'm having here tonight.
Yeah. So we may not always choose stuff that people can acquire, but I have had Garrison Brothers with you. You've introduced me to it, but not this particular varietal. So my choice tonight is the Wyoming Whiskey Outrider. Wyoming whiskey is obviously from Wyoming, to your point, around 50 states. And of course, Wyoming has lots and lots of grain. So they use locally farmed grain from the Blue Horn Basin in that region. They use water specifically from a specific limestone aquifer nearby. And honestly, I got this. I didn't know anything about it. Part of a whiskey club, so it shows up at my door. I try it. And really one of the darker and richer whiskeys that I've had, especially American, very rich, darker and richer than most bourbons and most ryes that I've had. So, and I'm enjoying it in an etched whiskey glass with my name etched into it that was given to me by my sister-in-law.
Oh. So what does it say on the bottle, what grains it's made from?
It probably does. It is a straight American whiskey. And just looking here, it's, as they say, it's not a bourbon, it's not a true rye. Mm-hmm. Hard to brand. I do know that they use, some grain, some corn, and mm-hmm. But it is a combination of, rye, corn, barley. But it doesn't say much about any percentages. But
yeah. Well, the Garrison Brothers being straight bourbon whiskey is at least 51% corn, but this is also they use wheat and barley. So it's a wheated bourbon. There's a certain category that has wheat instead of rye. Pappy Van Winkle is a famously expensive wheated bourbon that people may have heard about if we haven't had a chance to drink it.
So you mentioned some pretty expensive whiskey that I was out for dinner last night, and it was on their specials menu. They just kind of their specials, and I haven't often seen whiskey listed along with your other specials, but they had it for $70 an ounce.
Eesh. Yeah.
I did not partake. There was other options, but $70 an ounce is what they were selling it for.
Yeah, as with many things, I guess there's supply and demand. Value is defined by the customer, I guess, as we say in the lean.
At least the customer with cash in their pocket.
Yeah. All right. So let's talk about another. So let's shift to talking about lean in the news. And I saw a headline. It was on a number of. I found it a couple different places online. We'll post a link to the article in the show notes. But the headline read "Inside Fiat Chrysler's Toledo Turnaround," and it said, just give a couple of highlights here, that there was an uncommon level of union collaboration with Fiat Chrysler management and the UAW in Toledo, Ohio. That the product built there, the Jeep Wrangler, was so hot that the plant was running virtually around the clock. So the union pushed for a flexible system where workers could choose to work anywhere between 4 and 7 days a week, which was unusual. And one employee, Tracy Seymour, said, "Why we succeed is that the union and management came together." And so it sounds like there were a lot of creative approaches there to try to be successful together. Jamie, you have a lot of history and perspective here. In particular, I didn't realize when I picked the story about this plant.
Yeah, so I mean, I actually led the design of this initial factory. It's expanded and changed a lot since it was first built almost 20 years ago. So it's still one of their newest factories because you don't make that kind of investment quite often. Many of the key design principles that I tried to put in place or lost between my design efforts and the actual construction. But yeah, I worked with Chrysler for quite a long time. I helped build the Chrysler operating system. And this was really our first effort at building a new factory with the Chrysler operating system principles in place into the bricks and mortar. It also created an opportunity to perhaps develop a new work culture as you brought employees from the old factory that it replaced, which was the original Jeep factory built in, I believe, 1904 or something of that time frame. Mm-hmm. And kind of start up the factory with the right culture, capabilities, and process all at once.
And what was the time frame? Was that before you were at MIT? Was this?
It was actually around the same time. So it was partly leading that design, and we used lean methods to actually develop the design. Some of it, very very simple tools like pew charts to explore iterations of design. I think we got up to about 40 different iterations of the construct. But that's when we were doing the initial design, sort of even before we even got, say, all the permits needed to build a paint shop and some of the long lead items that you need in place. So yeah. I don't remember when it was launched, quite frankly. I'm going to guess it probably launched 2003, as it is quite a while to build a factory like that.
And that was in actually the Daimler Chrysler era.
That would have been, yeah. So the design itself preceded Daimler just by a little bit, and then Daimler took over, which is about the time that I left, along with almost all of the brain power behind the Chrysler operating system. And Daimler, of course, owned it for quite a while. Now Fiat does. And because of those major changes in direction and leadership, a lot of what we had put in place with the Chrysler operating system, unfortunately, some of it leaked away slowly, some of it stopped very quickly.
Well, and boy, that unfortunately that makes me think of situations in healthcare where hospitals have either gotten new ownership or through a merger or new leadership from the outside, and some very significant lean initiatives either are left to wither on the vine or are severely pruned back. We're talking about wine now, I guess, instead of whiskey, but it's really sad how how tenuous the grip can be.
Well, and that became, at least for me, as I mentioned earlier, I learned early on about the importance of behaviors and culture. The experience with the Chrysler operating system was very reinforcing. We often referred to it as a failure because of that reason. And I believe that if it's truly a culture, it will survive and management overturn. This was not yet embedded. I believe that the number of people that truly thought lean within the Chrysler operating system, you could count. You couldn't count on one hand. It was still a big number of people that had those set of beliefs. But relative to the 90,000 people in manufacturing as a specific subgroup, by no means was it more powerful than that. And unfortunately, with an event like an acquisition, a lot of people can leave in a very short period of time. And if you lose 2 and gain 2, you can survive. If you lose 25 of your top lean thinkers in a 18-month period, which is what I believe really happened there, it's pretty hard to keep the momentum going past that point.
Yeah. Well, one thing that jumped out at me in the article, it did make reference to automakers, following the lead of Toyota. And there were elements of lean thinking and lean practice in the article. So there's one section there that talked about some work that used to be backbreaking, and so that it was too hard on the workers, and conditions like that made it too easy for certain screws to be missed. And so the article said that there was something called a sweet seat designed, and I've seen this in other auto plants. Creating seats and fixtures that allow people to work more ergonomically and making the work easier. And the article said it reduced the number of defects. But the one thing that surprised, I don't know, the article, the way they wrote it, they seemed legitimately surprised that, oh my gosh, some of these ideas originated with the UAW people working on the factory floor. I'm like, well, that shouldn't be shocking at all.
Yeah, well, I'm constantly surprised. I don't say constantly, but periodically surprised, running across people that really feel that the folks out there just don't. There's no way they have good ideas. They feel that they need to design in all the controls so that they can get the outcomes that they want. And I even had a professor who taught lean stuff, basically believed you just design the system and everybody will do the right thing. And it's a hard thing to truly internalize unless you experience it, right? Yeah. And I remember, one of my most telling experiences was some of the early stages of the Chrysler operating system, and worked with a group of about 120 folks. And these would be Canadian Auto Workers Union, so CAW, slightly more aggressive usually than the UAW. But we implemented with that group of people 900 ideas in less than 6 months, and had massive performance.
That's awesome. Yeah.
As a result. And it was very very impactful to me. Not that these folks do have ideas or don't, but the momentum that their thought process can start to build once you get people looking at their own work.
Yeah.
I think that's the key is, I would always say, how can you know more about a job than someone that does it 500 times a day? Yeah. They probably understand every little idiosyncrasy they just might not have asked a new question about it. Right? And
Yeah.
so, but they understand it.
Yeah, I mean, the journalist could have taken the approach of, saying, well, isn't it amazing that the managers actually listened to them?
Right.
Because sometimes that's the missing part of the equation, right?
Yeah, and I never know, and I have several journalist friends. I never know what's done based on their bias and what's done for effect to hook the reader.
Sure.
But it certainly seemed like a genuine surprise. I agree with you there.
Yeah. So I don't know, any other thoughts you want to share about the
Well, I
story
think that
or time at Chrysler?
yeah, the key thing that stood out to me in this article was, um, so it is very clear union and management came together. Um, Union will, they kind of made it very clear in the article. We'll collaborate if you want to. We'll fight if you want to. Right? It's your call, but it's management's call. Right? You guys determine whether you want to collaborate or fight.
Yeah.
And how much of this was dependent on that one leader deciding that he wanted to collaborate.
Yeah.
And the article doesn't really go into how much this is effectively expanded. I know it's expanded, but how much is it effectively expanded beyond this one factory?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So maybe we'll have to go check into that, and we'll probably end up in future episodes. There'll be stories where I'm sure we'll end up talking about days back in the auto industry, and we'll continue swapping stories. And some of these stories can only be told over a drink, it seems.
Yeah, there's some there's some good ones and some bad ones, but one thing for sure is the auto industry always came with a lot of long work hours, and so that meant there's lots of stories to go along with it.
Yeah. All right. Well, so that's lean in the news, and we're going to do that, I think, in each of the episodes here. And gosh, we tried designing a format, but we're also going to practice Kaizen and continuous improvement with the format, right?
Yeah, we'll see what we like first of all, and we'll also
Yeah.
see what our listeners like.
Yeah.
And works for them. So there's always something to react to. But we do also want to take questions from people, stuff that prompts us for discussion. You put a teaser out on LinkedIn, and we got several questions already that we can work from. And I have to admit, some of my column writing is sometimes a client asks me a question. I don't really love my answer, so I go and really sharpen my own thinking by writing a column about it. So,
Yeah.
So our first question is from Beth Croft. The question is, how can we build the culture of lean? What do you recommend is the best tool or tactic to get an organization started? And those are big questions, right? We could probably write a multi-volume book series on that alone. But let's hone in on the best place to get started. So what are your thoughts on that?
Well, I mean, I get asked a lot. People will reach out and ask me questions that are some variety of what lean tools should we implement first? And I try to remind people there's a great chapter heading in Taiichi Ohno's book on the Toyota production system that says simply, start from need, right? So I try to redirect that, like what tool should we start with question back to a question around, well, what are you trying to accomplish and what problems are you trying to solve? And sometimes, I think there's a lot of interesting psychology around starting small, starting with baby steps. Like if the business is really crashing and burning, then we might need to address big issues. But I've just seen in so many different settings, starting off with a practice of small Kaizen, or some organizations call this daily Kaizen, just to get people engaged in solving problems that matter in their work, and just building participation and getting people learning and practicing plan, do, study, adjust cycles. Each individual might have different needs that they want to address. That's one way to get started.
Yep. Yeah, absolutely. Of course, you have to make sure, like the leader in the Chrysler example, you have to give people permission to do that, which is sometimes the hardest part. So I've always said it a little differently, but pretty much make the same point. Is I've always said, start with something that has an impact. And
Oh, mm-hmm.
the reason I've said it that way, I've just seen so many places start with something like 5S. And it's because of a book or a consultant. There's a lot of lean journeys that follow the consultant's roadmap. And while I operated in that space, I tried never to have a recipe that somebody else had to follow. But they'd start with something like 5S, and they'd focus on it for a year and not really impact people. It would be a bunch of work. It would make things slightly better, but for them, it wasn't really a problem. It didn't really have a positive impact, and so it put a bad taste in people's mouths. So I kind of say start with something that has an impact. Make sure that people are going to feel like their effort was worthwhile.
Yeah.
But I think the other aspect that I always go back to in starting is not just what to start with, but where. And so my phrasing has always been an inch deep, mile wide, or a mile deep and an inch wide. So the point is, you go work with one team and 10 people, and you're going to explore 40 different methods and go super deep, build a culture and a management system and everything else that goes along with it. You've only touched a portion of the organization. Or you're going to take one thing and go across the whole organization, really make it part, and then go another inch deep. And that's a question depends on economics. It depends on the current culture. It depends on a lot of things. There's no right answer to it.
Yeah.
But I think it's something people need to think through before they go too far.
Yeah, unfortunately, there's times where 5S is beneficial and as helpful as that can be in certain circumstances. Even worse than not making it better, it's just you read stories sometimes of people being like actively alienated, right? There was a story probably going back 10 years ago in the news in England. It was the British tax office, so the equivalent of the American IRS. And they had this lean office initiative, and they were telling people that they had to mark their keyboard and mouse location with tape outlines, and they couldn't have family photos on their desks. And I think, well, I don't think any of that was doing anything to make people's work easier, better, more fulfilling. So I could see why people kind of went to the media, and it became this big blow up. I could understand.
Yeah, I remember you sharing a lot of those stories, and I've seen. I remember. The chairman of a company, very respected in the company, and learning 5S from some of their internal lean people, and went on a rampage about how he's not going to put tape around a stapler. And that is, again, who are you starting with? Why are you starting there? And again, what's going to actually help people? I think you need to read your audience and push them, but push them just enough, right? You push people too hard, and you're going to get more resistance than you really bargained for. If you don't push them at all, then no learning's happening, and nobody's exploring what better really looks like. So, got to strike a balance there about how receptive the organization is.
Well, and going back to the first part of Beth's question, how do you build a culture of lean? Well, you're not going to make progress if you don't at least get people started and engaged and participating. And like, in healthcare, there's often a lot of talk around how do we get the doctors engaged? And sometimes a group of doctors will ask, how are we going to get the nurses engaged? Like, well, let's try, let's work on things. If we can be of service to the doctors, then they'll view lean as something positive instead of being something that's imposed on them. And if you can be of service to the doctors, then you're probably going to pique the interest of some who are then going to want to start participating and work toward that culture, right?
Right. And it's I'm going to have to pour myself another glass here.
Well, you don't have to, but you're choosing to.
That's a good point. That's a good point. I choose to. And as you can see, but our audience can't, I'm very close to finishing this bottle.
All right.
That's a shame, but I have enjoyed it. So I remember going back to my time at DT Energy, and this is right after Chrysler. And we did this massive study, kind of go out through interviews up and down the organization across the whole breadth. And what the conclusion was, here's what the executives said were the top 10 problems in the organization, but the rest of the organization doesn't get it. And the rest of the organization said, here's what the top 10 problems are in the company, but the executives don't get it. And it was the same list. It was almost identical to each other. And, the point was that, everybody was very cautious. Everybody wanted to have this perfect plan and figure out how we're going to convince everybody else to do stuff. At some point, you just got to start. You got to kind of have faith in other people. You don't have to have faith in lean, but you have to have faith in other people and get started.
Yeah. And I think that's what we're doing here with the podcast. Jamie and I have faith in each other that we can try to do something interesting here.
That's right. We certainly did plan, but I don't think we went anywhere close to over planning.
Right. So you're listening to two lean guys struggle with the right balance of standardized work and we're going to try to continuously improve, right?
Yeah, probably a mistake is we didn't drink whiskey while planning, only while podcasting. So maybe that would change something.
Yeah, but thank you, Beth. At least we had kind of at least a couple minutes to try to touch on the question, and I would encourage listeners, if you have questions, you can contact us through. You can contact us a number of ways. There's an email address, leanpodcast@gmail.com. You can contact us through LinkedIn or Twitter, or I had someone send me a message through Instagram, which is probably the least reliable way of trying to act. I don't look at, I don't think I even knew Instagram had a messages feature. So please don't try to contact me that way.
Although that works for me because I actually I'm a very visual guy. So I actually enjoy Instagram far more than some of the other platforms. So, either way, we're gonna put it on a list, and we already have more questions than we probably have time to answer in future episodes. So I'm sure we'll have plenty of questions and plenty of substance to chew on.
Yeah. So leanpodcast@gmail.com, and let's take another sip. Sometimes whiskey is something that you can chew on. They call this the Kentucky Chew.
Yes, although it's not limited to Kentucky bourbon as we know.
We have chewy Texas and Wyoming bourbons. So as we start to wrap up here, we're also going to try to touch on some fun stuff. And the NHL and NBA playoffs both started this past week. Do you have a particular team or teams that you're pulling for? What about you, Jamie?
Yeah, so neither are really my sport. So I'm a soccer guy, as most people at this point I share pretty openly with. So I like to use examples because a lot of people, at least familiar with, the environment. But it's also me. It's just my stuff. I like to bring who I am to the conversation. But basketball, which I watched the least of. I grew up kind of as a Lakers fan because I enjoyed some of the players back in that day, but I lived in Detroit for a lot of time.
Yeah.
Grew to really respect the Pistons as an organization, especially for what they did. So I'm going to pull for the Pistons. And in the NHL, I'm always been a Flyers fan, but they're not there. So I'm gonna have to say the Penguins. I do respect them as an organization, and I go to Pittsburgh fairly often for board meetings and other reasons. I was there most recently for the Industry Week conference, and boy, they are a heck of a sports town, and they really know how to do it right, respectfully and passionately. So I'm gonna say the Penguins.
Because the Philadelphia fans don't always have that respectful reputation.
Well, that's why I kind of have to add that, right? Because while I'm a Philly fan for the Flyers, but probably not the other sports, I have a pretty eclectic view of how I became fans of different teams. But no, Philly, and it's not just other teams, right? See, sometimes even their own teams not terribly respectful of their own of sports teams in general. So, how about yourself? Who are you pulling for?
Well, so it's funny. You're pulling for teams in the East. I'm pulling for two teams that are in the Western Conference of both sports. It's funny you mentioned the Pistons. I grew up in the Detroit area. That was a team I followed when I was a kid. They won 2 championships while I was in high school. This was the Isaiah Thomas era of the quote unquote bad boys.
Yep, one heck of an era.
That was my team. My wife and I lived in San Antonio for 3 years, and I'll tell you that we fell in love with the San Antonio Spurs. The team, their approach, just that town. Like if you live in San Antonio, you have to love the Spurs. It's an obligation,
right?
Civic obligation. But so yeah, I am pulling for the Spurs. They had game 1 the other night was on at 9:30 in the evening, and I'm getting old, and that's hard to stay up and watch. It's on that late. But they won game 1, and then when it comes to hockey, I grew up a Red Wings fan, again with Detroit. They are not in the playoffs this year, so I am pulling for the Dallas Stars, and I'm actually going to their game 3 of their first round series with a couple of buddies of mine. So that's now the local team, and I'm going to pull for them.
Excellent. Well, it's hard to beat the Red Wings from a fan base standpoint. I'll tell you, trying to run a factory on second shift with the Red Wings in the playoffs, there's more unique ways to get TVs in view of every particular person that cared while all running the factory than I can imagine. So tough to beat that as a passionate fan base.
Well, so yeah, well, the Red Wings have been easy to beat the last couple of years because they did have a historically long run of maybe like 20 straight years in the playoffs, which the Spurs have very much, they're like, I think 22 consecutive years in the playoffs. And it's been hard as a Red Wings fan to see them not make the playoffs. If the Spurs go through a rough patch like that, it'll be difficult for Spurs fans. But I do want to follow up and ask, wait a minute, did you say you had TVs in the factory?
Well, they weren't authorized TVs. They weren't put up by management. But there were ways. There were TVs in the factory. And you had to walk a balance of when to shut them down and when not to. But yeah, there were enough that at least they only seemed to come out when the Red Wings were in the playoffs.
Yeah. Well, and I do remember reading stories about it's now closed. The GM Janesville, Wisconsin plant.
Yes.
Monday night, second shift, when the Green Bay Packers were on Monday Night Football, they had this dilemma of if you didn't let people watch the game, they'd call in sick and they couldn't build any trucks. And management actually did bring out, I believe, authorized TVs.
Yeah.
And I don't know if I want a truck built that day. And there's also jokes in the auto industry about you don't want to buy a vehicle that was built at the beginning of deer hunting season either, because there was a lot of absenteeism.
Yep. Some of the challenges, but sports is big business for a reason. So people want to follow, and I have to admit, when my soccer teams are on, I try my darndest to make sure I can see it live.
Yeah. And so I brought things back to a dark auto industry place, but sports can also help bring people together. My wife, who's not really naturally a sports fan, when she's worked in different places, has tried to embrace the local sports team as a way, it's a way of connecting with employees and colleagues. And that's an important part of organizational culture, right?
Absolutely. And it's, part of connecting, connect around a common interest, and you don't have to be as passionate as someone else, but it's something to engage around.
Yeah. And even though I'm not a soccer fan, Jamie hopefully is still going to remain friends and keep doing the podcast.
As long as you don't put down the wrong team, you're okay.
Well, I won't put down any team, so we don't
All
really
right.
have to worry about that. So, well, it's been fun. I think our hypothesis was that this would be a fun thing to do, right?
Yes, it was.
So I think we'll do it again. Want to ask people to look for us out there on Apple Podcasts and Google Play, and we'll get the podcast added to other platforms. I do have that domain name that's actually now going to use, leanwhiskey.com. And we debated, do you spell it with a whiskey with a KEY.com? I think I actually own Lean Whiskey without the E, which is how the Scottish, they spell
Yes.
whiskey WISKY.
If you're a purist that believes that nobody else can actually make the stuff, then that is the proper spelling. But
Right. So maybe I gave up that domain. So I'll just, in the future, here's a Kaizen opportunity, Lean Whiskey, KEY.com. And that'll forward you to leanblog.com/lean whiskey. Jamie's website, if you want to mention it, or where people can find episodes there if they want.
yeah, so that's jflinch.com /lean whiskey. So you can either find the blog post and we'll have them in there, or we'll have them all posted in that particular page.
Yeah. So ask us, please go, if you like the podcast, or at least if you think it has potential, to subscribe, and please rate and review. That'll help others find the podcast. So Jamie, I guess we did it. That's episode 1 of Lean Whiskey.
Episode 1, our wet run is in the bag, and looking forward to first of all our listener feedback, but also looking to episode 2.
Yeah, and people can use leanpodcast@gmail.com as a way of providing feedback or asking questions for future podcasts. So some whiskeys are packaged in a bag. The bottle comes in a bag, but so when you say in the bag, there's another whiskey reference. Maybe I'm trying too hard to find those. So cheers.
Cheers.
Kampai. Thanks, Jamie. We'll do it again soon, I hope.
Talk to you soon.